When I talk about sort of aspects of socialism, I think it's important to understand that what I'm interested in is compassion and kindness in politics, and actually beyond that, love. And how do we have systems that are able to convey quite basic spiritual principles, I would say, that are, common in Christianity and Islam and all great and minor faiths when we look beyond the kind of cultural divisions that can easily arise from religion. What it offers us, I think, is the opportunity to infuse our systems of government and control with an emotional and spiritual quality. I feel that what we're living in now, in this sort of it's not right to say nihilistic, because there is so much charge when it comes to meaning in our political space. But what there is a lack of, I believe, is spirit and kindness. That everywhere we look, there is kind of deception, there is hatred, there is a lack of real vision. And I would say that that's prevalent throughout the mainstream, whether it's on the purported left or right. What kind of advances have you noticed? Where do you look optimistically on the intervening years since our conversation? Where can you say, well, this has improved, this has gotten better?
Well, so I think one of our differences, which we had early on, and I think we still hold, is I actually don't look for compassion and emotion in politics. I think that it actually needs to be extracted from politics. And I think that part of the reason is that we've moved away from logic and reason and objectiveness and more towards emotion and compassion, which is subjective, and that's why it's problematic. And emotion can yield to some really bad things. We've seen this over the years when people are being so invested in their emotions that they're not thinking clearly. And actually the people that tend to seize control when people are emotional is the government. So I am very much like, how I feel doesn't actually matter. We have to remain objective about these things. And I was just having a conversation this morning with my in-laws about that. They're overseas at the moment, and talking about women and women in politics, and why I don't know that it necessarily works all the time. And I was talking about this, I've been talking about this on my show for years. We are naturally more emotional than men. I hate to pretend that there are biological differences between men and women, but there are. And that emotion is a wonderful thing when it comes to caretaking and nurturing and raising children. But I think in the political realm, we often have our emotions hijacked. And when they are hijacked, it can yield great evil. And I think we're in a circumstance where there's a lot of emotion being hijacked and yielding great evil.
I agree with you that logic and rationalism are necessary for logistics, operations, and organisation. You can't organise a society based on, I feel very jealous, or I feel very joyful, or I feel very sad. But when creating a vision, there has to be an emotional component. There has to be that humanity has some value, that we are not just material blobs fighting for individual survival and making necessary pacts with one another, whether that's on a global scale or a communal scale, or just the interrelationship between two people for our shared and mutual survival. So I don't think that emotion is a basis for government, but it is the place from where we need to derive our vision. So I don't think that it's in any way ridiculous to suggest that kindness ought to be a part of politics. And also I would say, because I recognise what you're disputing and contesting there, I think many of the people that purport to be advocating for kindness and compassion and for example, rights of previously or currently maligned groups are actually not doing that at all. They're using those ideas to mask the same kind of corporatism, authoritarianism, ability to censor, ability to surveil, ability to shut down that has always characterized authoritarianism, whether it's from the right or the left, or these new emergent terms like centralist and peripheral. Like, there's no question that the call them a leftist government if you will, although it doesn't sort of fit with my terminology, the current American administration are an authoritarian administration, that they're about the imposition of power and control, even the way that the war is discussed, the conversation, sort of the shaming of people that won't sort of align with their perspective on cultural issues. For me, I don't see that as emotion. I see that as manipulation.
Right, exactly. So it's the manipulation of emotions. And I think, I definitely agree with you. I just think that I can arrive at the conclusion of our humanity logically. I don't need emotions to do that. I logically deduce that we are human beings and that, of course, we shouldn't be doing things. We shouldn't be imparting evil on individuals. It's not because of an emotional aspect that I don't think that we should be imparting evil. But yes, you're exactly right. What we're seeing right now is this authoritarian governments across the world that are pretending to care about people, compassion, wear a mask, save lives. Well, how could you not want to save lives? If you don't want to wear a mask, then you're a horrible person and you're trying to kill everybody. And that's why I really think it's important to steel yourself against that sort of a manipulation. And when you speak about that, though, they kind of frame you as a harsher person, which is something that I've definitely suffered in the media, is this hardening of Candace Owens. She doesn't have a heart. It's not that I don't have a heart, I just also have a brain. And I'm very fearful of government encroaching into our personal lives. And I had done everything to insulate my family from that. And the best way to do that is to tether people to their brains and, not saying more than their hearts, but just to remember that you do have a brain and you should use it.
I don't find you to be a hard person. I think that you're actually a deal of fun and that you're very bright and sparky and a joy to be around, actually. But I do think that you are a sort of deliberately iconoclastic. I think you are a great provocateur. I think you enjoy saying controversial things. That's sort of my assessment of you. But I believe that all of those things are possible within joy and good humour, and of course within the parameters of accepting that you have had a completely different life to me. You're completely entitled to an entirely different political perspective, and in any kind of democracy worthy of the name, you would accept and embrace those differences. Now, last time we were talking, we spoke a lot about populism in the most sort of common and broad terms. Brexit regarded to be a sort of an emergence of a nationalist populism in my country. Trump commonly regarded as a sort of an outlier and a new type of populism. But in a sense, these markers don't hold up to scrutiny, because across Europe prior to Brexit, there were numerous populist movements in response to the 2008 financial crash. And in your country, sort of protest movements like Occupy, which I grant you was sort of a truly global movement, as that financial crash was also global. Would you argue now that populism and those populist events, Trump, Brexit, were not anomalies, but in fact the new normal? That what we're witnessing is a kind of an end of at least a strong appetite for a different type of politics. Just one sort of conversational example, like I think that Ron DeSantis, who's been a guest on our show, and I'm sure you've spoken to him, and I found him to be a delightful man, I understand is suffering in the polls because he is too much like a regular politician in a media landscape where what people want now are accessible, personable, identifiably anti-establishment figures like Donald Trump, and let's take, for the sake of this conversation, the emergent forces of Vivek Ramaswamy, who I know you're very fond of, and RFK, whose populism and popularity at least is another marker of change.
Yeah, I think for me personally, the reason why I said from the very beginning it didn't matter how much money that Ron DeSantis had, that his campaign was going to be a flop, and that prognostication has proven true, it's not necessarily because he seems too much like a politician. It's because there's something about him that feels like he kind of checks which way the wind is going and maybe checks with his donors before he says something. And it really comes down to your gut instinct about an individual. And I think it matters. I actually think it matters. There's something that feels less trustworthy with him. And that's not to say that you need to be extremely personable and a great speaker. I mean, I actually find RFK interesting because of the work that he's done. And I'm obviously not a Democrat and I wouldn't vote for him. But I think that the work that he has done regarding vaccines and, sort of standing up to the medical establishment his entire life is something that's noteworthy. He's done something different. He's done something brave. And to hear him continue to do that is something that makes me want to gravitate towards him. I don't think any of us would say RFK Jr. is one of the great orators of our time necessarily. And so, people are responding to looking at an individual. I think they're taking what they're saying and what they're doing and wondering if this person will have enough courage, because it takes a lot of courage when you get into a position of power to stand up to the authoritarian, whether it's the CDC or any of the other bodies that they've created. And I just don't know that I feel that way about Ron DeSantis. Vivek Ramaswamy is doing a lot of different things. I didn't really think anything of him until I had him on my show. And I just had a very good conversation. I felt like, okay, I kind of understand who this person is. He's a true academic. He's extremely ambitious, but it felt more authentic. So, I guess you could say that could be something that has to do with the populist movement, and people are naturally distrusting. But I think it's something else. I think it's gut instinct. And I think that people want to measure you against, did you stand up to this? Did you stand up to that? What is your actual record? And Ron DeSantis is a great governor. I have nothing bad to say about him. If I was living in Florida, I'd try to vote for him 10 times if I could. But I never thought that he was going to be able to have the same success nationally.
Well, it wouldn't be possible to vote 10 times because, as you know, there are no problems with voting in Florida or anywhere else. It's one vote per living human being, as has been well established for a long time now. I think it's not just about oratory, but just authenticity more is what people appear to be craving now, Candice, that people are sort of starting to sense that our sanitized, empty, hollow political rhetoric isn't leading anywhere. Another thing, because you sort of, I guess it's fair to say that your position is generally a conservative, how do you feel when issues such as free speech and a broad and general anti-war stance appear to now have become conservative issues? There's been this extraordinary flip where the liberal peacenik cultural revolution, let it all hang out, let's smoke a doobie man party has become the party of have a war, don't question a war, don't talk about potential peaceful or diplomatic solutions. And obviously when it comes to censorship, the liberal democratic left it appears more censorial based on the relationships that have been demonstrated between them and the sort of social media sites, for example, and their use of various deep state agencies to control narratives, and in fact, just the continuum of censorship across successive administrations, Snowden onward. So when the values like free speech and anti-war can become untethered from one side of the political aisle, what does that do to your position? And do you think it's a fair assessment to just acknowledge that these changes have taken place?
Yeah, these changes are taking place. What I would say is the right is still very much pro-war as well. I mean, I think we saw this on the Republican debate stage where how many people were saying you had Pence, you had Nikki Haley, and this is why we talk about the military-industrial complex, because it encompasses the left and the right. But speaking outside of the political players and just to the individuals, I think what's happening is I've tried to actually assess it is people that are left-leaning have actually always been emotional. And so what's happened, though, is the emotional arguments are now being transpired to make them support things that they've never supported in the past, right? So it still works, if you're saying, end the war in Vietnam, there's emotions, let's end the war, hippies, okay, we want this to be over. And now you're saying, well, no, go to war, because think about the Ukrainian children, think about, how awful Putin is. It's still a hijacking of emotions, but the end result, I think, is actually different. So they haven't necessarily changed. They've perhaps grown more emotional, or I would say the media has grown just increasingly so focused on emotions all the time that they're not even thinking. It's just, how could you not feel bad for the Ukrainian children? How could you be so awful that you don't want to send billions? Who cares if there's no accounting? It's kind of going into a black hole, and we're giving less to the people that are in Maui. It's your job to constantly care about something. Here is the current thing that you need to care about.
That's really interesting, because it makes you wonder if there's any actual principles present at all. Like that, if you have my position on being anti-war is surely at this point in evolution, we must be able to come to peaceful solutions. Surely this is our duty. And I would say that whether it's the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, Vietnam War, Korean War, current war between Russia and Ukraine, and in all of those wars, the death of civilians and children of all creeds and nationalities is appalling. When it comes to the subject of free speech, we were talking in the 1960s 60s or whatever about civil rights movement, pro-women, gay, different ethnic minorities or cultural groups, when it was them spearheading that cultural movement, their free speech was important. And now I think free speech is, I mean, these are all, what the point of principles is they can an immediate agenda, isn't it? It's like your principle doesn't just sort of shift depending on what your objective is. Oh, I don't like war. Oh, actually, I do like war. And it seems that what's happened is that war has become packaged in quite unique ways. And I agree with your analysis that it's emotionally packaged. But what the genuine power behind it appears to be an ulterior or transcendent power, depending on your perspective, in specifically the military-industrial complex, are able to make sure that the American project remains a military one for economic rather than ideological reasons. And I suppose that that's a rational discourse and a rational analysis. But for me, it comes from an emotional place, because I think it isn't right to kill people and use violence as a way to resolve disputes. So it's a sort of a fusion of both emotion and rationale, because rationale can lead to genocide, brutality, and so can emotion. So, I wonder what you thought about that little moral snake's nest I've flung your way.
No, I totally agree with you. And this is why I was staunchly against, even from the very beginning, day one. It's like, we just pull out of Afghanistan. Now you're telling us that we need to all focus on Ukraine. And the Americans is kind of being set to believe that we constantly have to be worrying about everybody else's problems, right? That if you say, okay, we have plenty of problems here on our own, why don't we focus on those, that you're somehow rotten and you're somehow backwards. And again, there's no accounting for it. You think about, you've got IRS agents that can, God forbid you send $200 on PayPal, you can be fined by the IRS. I can log into my bank account and I can see every single charge, but we have no idea where billions of dollars are going into a black hole. And it's very obvious that there are kickbacks, and this is why the politicians want to keep these wars going. I mean, that to me is just a rational, logical conclusion that most people don't see when the current thing arrives, because there's this full media effort, because part of the military industrial complex is also the media. The media is reinforcing these ideals, reinforcing these principles that we constantly have to be the moral police in the world. Quite frankly, I'd like to mind our own business. I don't know why we insist that the way that we want to live has to be the exact way that every single person in the world wants to live. I live in America. I like American values, I like American principles. I don't necessarily think that people in Iran and Iraq have to enjoy the way that I live or the way that I dress or the freedom that I want to express. And so they use this moral policing argument, and you saw this on the debate stage. It's one of the reasons that I would never vote for Nikki Haley, why Mike Pence I would not vote for, is because they say, no, it is our job, and they use these Cold War arguments, and this is why we must do this, and Russia could become the Soviet Union again, when in fact it's us that has military boots all across the world. It's us that's actually encroaching into other people's territory, and people are completely delusional about that fact. And when you say it, you're public enemy number one, but I've been public enemy number 1 and 2 and 3 for a while now, so it's okay.
You've been